Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through all of the books that I picked up in the month of January, as well as a few that I picked up at the end of December and just haven't yet had a chance to talk about. January was a really full reading month for me. I picked up a lot of books, I enjoyed a lot of the books that I picked up, and I actually read from a decent amount of other genres. Still predominantly picked up fantasy, and even more specific, still predominantly picked up adult fantasy, but I am going to actually structure this based off of the books from different genres. We have science fiction, classics, romance, fantasy, romance, romantasy, and as noted, the bulk of today would be fantasy, specifically adult fantasy books. I'm going to actually start with the sci-fi. I'm actually going to start basically with all the genres except for fantasy, because even all of these combined don't make up the amount of fantasy books that I read. So let's go ahead and kick it off with science fiction. The book that I read this month was Velocity Weapon, and this was a lot of fun. I had such a blast with this book. I have been interested in picking up something by this author before, and now this just secures for me that I need to go back and read basically everything this author has written anytime I'm in the mood for a really fun, explosive sci-fi story. The setup for this one is you follow two main characters that are siblings, one of whom is named Sanda, who wakes up on an enemy ship hundreds of years after a battle, and her body was preserved through sci-fi means, basically. And when she awakens, she's informed of all of this by the AI of this ship that she is on. So now she's on a mission of survival, but also she's trying to figure out all the details of what happened, and there is a question of whether or not she can even trust the information that she's being given. And then we have her brother's perspective, and because of the fact that Sanda's exist 200 years after a battle, when you're with him, you are seeing him directly after the battle that he believes killed his sister. And he is somebody who is essentially like a politician within their society. He's known as a keeper. He has a chip that has been inserted into him that holds all the secrets to their society, basically. But he also is displeased with how the other keepers are handling situations, and he makes it his life's goal, basically, to try to bring truth to the public. However, the other keepers have found a way to kind of keep him under their thumb, where he can't really rebel against them without it being a rebellion against himself, as he is now elected the official of the keepers, and specifically the official speaker on their behalf. So they kind of always are watching him, and he's somewhat of a puppet. He's trying to have his own agency within that. So those are your two main perspectives. You do have the occasional other perspective that comes into the picture as well, that just kind of shows you that there's more going on in this world than even what you think you know from these two perspectives. There's a lot of twists and turns, that classic summer blockbuster feel. It was just such a great time, and I do think sometimes books that are fun, they end up feeling like they're, well, nowadays, I should clarify, nowadays books that are fun, I think, are leaning into cozy territory, which is completely fine. But as far as that kind of action-packed adventure fun story, this one, it feels like it's reminiscent of a different time while also still having a lot of pieces to it that made it feel fresh and unique. It was a lot of fun. I had a blast with this one, and I'm excited to keep going with the series. Moving now to the classics that I picked up, I do want to quickly acknowledge that I recognize classics in and of themselves can be distinguished through whatever genre that they are within, but I wanted to have a dedicated section within my wrap-ups to classics as I read more of them over the course of this year, so that's why I'm choosing to categorize them in this fashion. But regardless, the two that I picked up this month would be Wuthering Heights and Frankenstein. I'm only about 65% of the way through Wuthering Heights. I haven't yet completed it, so I'm going to reserve my final thoughts for a future video, but I did want to at least give the heads up that I am most of the way through this, and I wouldn't say I'm enjoying it. I think a better way to categorize my feelings would be say I am engaged in what's happening, and you almost feel bad feeling interested and intrigued by things because these people are terrible. But I had a feeling that's what I was going to get into with Wuthering Heights, because one of my best friends is obsessed with this book, and that's how she's always talked about it. It's like, oh, these people are terrible. So I at least knew people were terrible in this, but I've never seen any adaptations. I've never read it. I didn't read either of these in high school or in college. I knew nothing about them. And like I said, with Wuthering Heights, all I really had was that these people are terrible. And that's accurate. That's a very accurate assessment of this book. But Frankenstein, I can talk about a little bit more, as I did complete this one. I loved Frankenstein. I thought it was phenomenal. I didn't know what the environment was going to be like, the writing style. I didn't know what the themes in the story were, but I appreciated basically everything about it. I thought, too, that there was a lot about it that was, I think, relatively clear in what it's trying to convey. I think there's a lot of modernity versus nature within this story. And I also think that there's a lot about abandonment, criticism of, or at the very least, maybe criticism of the perception of God and religion at the time, and how this idea of man and his hubris, which also relates to modernity versus nature, this idea that man is trying to almost be God in and of himself, or that he is trying to rival nature in his endeavors. It was fantastic. The writing was beautiful. It was stunning. There's so many moments that if you just took a quote out, you could flip to basically any page and take a quote out, and it feels stunning. I mean, I think that the writing, it's not just because it's a classic either. I think that the writing, Mary Shelley just has a way of capturing what she's trying to convey in language that is so beautiful and descriptive, but also very cutting at the same time. I wouldn't personally say that I felt like this was character focused quite in the same way as other stories. It was more of like, I do think the characters almost represented things in and of themselves, but that didn't take away from the fact that they also still felt real enough. Because I do think sometimes when you have stories that feel almost like a fable, or you have stories that feel like a fairy tale in a sense, sometimes within those stories, when you have characters that are almost serving a certain purpose, or they are a representation of a certain feeling, or they're more just meant to be like this physical manifestation of something the author is trying to say. Whenever you have that in stories, I do think sometimes those characters don't feel real at all. I feel this is common in a lot of mythology retellings as well, which in a sense you could argue Frankenstein is a mythology retelling. But regardless, I don't think that she lost out on still having us connect to the characters. There are aspects of them that you relate to. The monster, the amount of times that I was just like, somebody love him. And I was upset. I was quite upset as I was reading this story. And there's a lot of questions about, is the monster actually the villain, or is it Victor Frankenstein? And the idea of abandonment and wanting companionship in life, and also the repressing of what is seen as improper or an affront to nature was really well accomplished in this story. My husband and I actually buddy read this one together, and we did a really in-depth conversation for it. So it was a buddy read with my patrons, and we also did a live show with them. And then my husband and I just have had the best time discussing this book and going really, really, really in-depth. Obviously today I'm not getting into spoilers, but we do get into spoilers there. And we are going to be doing a movie watch. We're going to do a Discord movie night. So if you're interested in watching the movie with us, the new Frankenstein, feel free to join the Patreon and join us for that. Any tier, anybody is welcome to all of the perks from my Patreon. So if you want to join us in buddy reads, if you want to join us in live shows, reading sprints, and in this case, a Discord movie night, you are welcome to do so. But I'm very curious to see how the movie does everything. We've avoided looking at trailers or anything of that sort. Also, I have to note that no, we did not choose these books because both of them happen to have recent adaptations, and also no, we did not choose them because both of them have Jacob Elordi in them. That just was a weird coincidence, but Sean is like, people are gonna think I'm obsessed with Jacob Elordi, because he actually picked Wuthering Heights up recently, and then I was like, I'll read it, and I was like, I don't think anyone will think that, but also for Sean's sake, Sean's not obsessed with Jacob Elordi. That is not the reason we're picking this up. I have one more thing to say though, and this one is about Jacob Elordi. I personally think that he would be such a good Giselle from First Law by Joe Abercrombie. Does anybody else see it? Am I the only one that sees it? I feel like he would play Giselle perfectly, but maybe that's just me. I don't know. I think it would be really great casting. I think he's getting to a point though where if that were ever to get an adaptation, then he would end up being too old to play that role. But right now, in my mind, I think as far as actors that I think perfectly capture certain characters, I think he could play Giselle, and I've always thought that, I'm completely spacing on his name, Matthew Barry would be the perfect character from Mistborn, Breeze. He is Breeze, right? He's Breeze. Those two actors, I think that is basically who I envision when I've read those books. Moving on now, though, we'll go romance, and then fantasy romance and romantasy, and then we'll segue into adult fantasy. I'll start with the contemporary romance book that I picked up, which would be An Academic Affair. I've been doing a lot of home projects around the house, and I just really wanted something that wasn't too world building heavy, something that was just kind of easy to get lost in. Feels like you have a movie on kind of a thing. And I was like, let's go ahead and pick up a contemporary romance. And An Academic Affair is about these two individuals who are very, very educated. And they happen to also not have a lot of job security. They have gone through school together. They've always kind of been like academic rivals. And they also have lived together before in this house with a bunch of other roommates just because rent is expensive and they're just trying to get by. And they don't want to give up and end up taking a job that has nothing to do with their degrees. They really want to pursue this. This is their passion. But the job market is extremely slim. It's extremely competitive. And they are the brightest of the bunch. They are incredibly skilled, but they cannot get a job. So when job opportunities do arise, they end up being in competition with each other, and they are frustrated with each other. They're frustrated that this always happens. They're frustrated that they're always in each other's orbit, but they both really want this job, so they both go for it. One of the characters realizes that the other, even though she is very qualified for this job, even though it would seem that she's the one that's going to get this job, she also recognizes that on a personal level, her academic rival has reasons why this job is perhaps more important to him because of some things that have happened to his sister. And this new job is where she lives. He would be able to be there for her and in some ways even help provide for her and her kids. So there's a tiny little clause within this job offering that if you and your spouse are both qualified, that they can do almost like a spousal hire where you can also then teach at this university. So she approaches him and says, hey, I know that this is going to sound insane, but also it actually makes a lot of sense. We both need this job. I think we should just get married. And then there's a chance that they'll hire both of us. And that is the thing that they end up doing. It sounds like a kind of wild premise, but the book also, one, acknowledges that it's wild. Like the characters truly understand that this is kind of a crazy situation to put themselves in, but they know that this is probably their only chance at getting a job in their field. And I appreciate it, especially because I have friends that have PhDs and everything. I actually really appreciated how rigorous the employment pursuit is because the job market can be insanely difficult. You would think, oh, the more experience I have, the more education I have, the more that I will be above the competition. But what happens at times is that there are only so many jobs that even need somebody of that level. And so anybody that has that level of education, they all want that one job that comes up. So I felt like that was really, really realistic. And I also think it speaks to almost like this criticism of capitalism, you could say, where people are feeling like they have to get married in order just to have job security, things like that. So I thought that was done really well. The characters, I thought their chemistry made sense. And I also appreciate it. I didn't even know this was possible because I'm not extremely well versed in contemporary romance. I've read some here and there. But I'm like, you're telling me that the third act breakup doesn't have, it can just be a third act conflict? It doesn't have to be a breakup? I was shocked. I didn't realize that was possible. I thought that was kind of part of the blueprint, in the same way that people say in order for something to be a romance, it has to have a happily ever after. I thought the third act conflict had to be a breakup because that's all basically I've ever seen. I didn't know that you could just have some kind of conflict that relates to the characters. And that bumped this book up for me because I'm like, why don't we do this more? We should do this more. The third act breakup sometimes is so forced and it's so irritating, and you just want to shake the characters because they can be really logical, or even if the situations they find themselves in are full of shenanigans. It's nice when they themselves feel like real people, which is part of the aim, I find, in a lot of contemporary romance, is the relatability factor. So the fact that oftentimes they end up sort of suddenly becoming ridiculous in order just to have that conflict at the end. Like I said, I didn't realize that you could actually just have conflict instead of breakup. Like, wait a second, I overheard you talking to somebody about something, and then now we can't ever be together. And then the next day they're like, oh, I see what you actually meant. Okay, sorry, my bad. Let's get married. And it was like, oh, it's so nice to not have that be so trivial. The conflict I thought was actually made sense, and I appreciated the conflict. I also appreciated the family dynamics within the story. I had a lot of fun with it. I had a lot of fun with An Academic Affair, and I thought a lot of the aspects to it that were kind of the catalysts for some of the plot actually felt like they were touching on some real world problems. I quite enjoyed this one. As for the fantasy romance and romantasy, I picked up 2 books. One of them would be The Twisted Throne. This is technically the 5th book in the Bridge Kingdom series, so unfortunately I can't give too many specifics. If you don't know anything about how the series is structured, it's made up of a collection of duologies, so the first 2 are kind of their own story following the love story of 2 of the characters. Same idea for the next 2, and then so obviously this is the start to the 3rd duology. And these characters are always somewhat connected to each other. So you've actually seen this character since book 1, and now we're finally diving into her story. And the setup for her story is that she is part of a marriage alliance to this very, very deadly kingdom, where it's deadly because nobody actually really says what they mean. So there's a lot of political intrigue and backstabbing, and you're constantly trying to figure out, is this person lying? Is this person telling the truth? And also, is this person currently on my side, but they have some end goal that will actually go against me? But even if that's true, and if I'm able to assess that, is it better to join with them now so that I can just get by? So it's a lot of that kind of sneakiness, and I genuinely enjoy a lot of that. I also enjoy Danielle Jensen's writing of romantasy, fantasy romance style books, because I find that the plots are actually more of the focus, but the romance feels like it's intertwined with the plots instead of it being like the romance is there and it's just in a fantasy world, or the romance is there and it feels like the plot is just serving the purpose of the characters coming together. This one actually felt like both of the main perspectives in this story, they had reasons for why they felt the way they felt, or they had their own motivations, and sometimes the other character actually went against that, so there was natural tension that built up as a result of politics and the actual, as I said, personal character motivation. So I had a lot of fun with this one. I am going to pick up the next one. I have enjoyed, as far as fantasy, romance, and romantasy, the Bridge Kingdom series as it's continued. I do think that the characters from one story to the next feel different from each other. I like the way that they continuously build on one another. They're not magic oriented whatsoever. So if you're like, I like magic and monsters and things like that, not quite what you're getting with these. I like the politics though, so I had fun. The other one was an arc that I read, and unfortunately this one was a miss for me, and that would be this Immortal Heart. I have read a couple of other books by this author, and I enjoyed them well enough. They are mythology retellings, and this one, it seemed like it... I personally wish the author had just stuck to a mythology retelling and not really made an effort to make it romantasy. There's different approaches, of course, to how people do retellings, especially mythology retellings. Some people take the barest of the bare inspirations. So for example, you see a lot of Hades and Persephone retellings, but they're not even trying to be super accurate to the source material. It's kind of like Hades is the god of the underworld, and thus he's just this guy that runs a gambling den, and he is in this like dark alley, and there's that kind of feel. And Persephone is like this innocent journalist who's trying to figure out more about this dark underworld area. And you're like, okay, they just took the idea and then they did something more modern with it or whatever. So that's obviously one way to approach this. Another is to actually take these tragic love stories from these mythologies and then maybe focus on those a little bit more if it's within the context of a greater mythology. And in this one, we're looking at Ares and Aphrodite, and I think there's potential there. But this author, I would say, has a tendency to focus more so on the actual original story. So as a result, the romance, I kept kind of being like, I feel like the balance is really weird. Either lean in and make it more romance, or just take this part out and focus on the mythology, because it kept feeling like for me, it didn't feel like I was getting enough of either. And unfortunately, I didn't feel invested in the plot. I felt like a lot of this story read like snapshots. I think the intention was to have that feeling of the gods, time doesn't work the same for them as it does for mortals. But as a result, it just felt like I kept getting pieces of events, and I wanted to feel a little bit more in it. I think that's a hard thing to do when you're writing these godlike characters, if this is what you're going for. But I did feel like a lot of it was snapshots. And then in addition, the romance also felt like snapshots. So then I wasn't really invested, unfortunately, in basically anything. Like I said, this was an arc. It's not coming out for a bit. If you are interested in the idea of Ares and Aphrodite, then maybe this one will work for you. I know sometimes that more bird's eye view in capturing the perspective of gods actually does really work for people. So maybe for some of you this will really work. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work for me. I have still enjoyed other works by this author. I'll still try other things by this author, but I don't know if the Romantasy lane was, I just don't think it quite worked for my taste. Now finally to the many, many fantasy books that I picked up this month. I am going to go through these a little bit faster because a lot of them have either been mentioned in other videos or will be mentioned in additional videos that I've done. I'll have any videos where I go more in depth linked in case you would like more than just a brief overview of them. But kicking it off, we have The Sirens, A Natural History of Dragons, and books 2 and 3 of Gael Song, so I'll start there. Gael Song, I have talked, it feels like endlessly about this series ever since I picked up the first book. I loved the first book. It's a historical fantasy, specifically following Irish folklore. I also really, really appreciated just how much the author really captured this time period and the events of this time period. She's incredibly knowledgeable. And so it's basically, it feels like you're reading a real account of this time. And also the way that these magical people are incorporated into the story, it feels like that was actually how things were. And whenever you're reading a story where you are pulling from the mythology or the lore of that time and you're writing within our own world and you're doing historical fiction in this way, I feel like this is how you do it. There's a reason that ever since I picked up the first book, Children of Gods and Fighting Men, I've continuously said this is one of my favorite historical fantasy series because it just feels like the perfect blend of historical fiction and fantasy. And books 2 and 3 just continued to pull me in. Throughout the story was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going to happen. If you take these characters away from me, if anything bad happens to them, I'm going to be upset. And I had a lot of feelings over the course of the story. There were things I thought were going to happen that didn't happen at all. There were things that I'm like, oh, I just have a feeling it's going to go this direction. And sometimes it would, but not in the way I anticipated. It really kept me on my toes. I also just couldn't get enough of how terrible one of the characters is. So you have two main perspectives. Over the course of the trilogy, you do kind of expand those perspectives a bit, but there are two main perspectives. And one of them might be I don't want to say definitively she's my favorite antagonist perspective that I've gotten, but she's one of my favorites. She is so awful, and she continues to be awful. And she also, the way that she continues to see herself as the person who is constantly basically the recipient of other people's stupidity, or other people are just putting her down. And she always sees herself as basically the victim of everyone else. And you're like, what are you talking about? You've caused so many of these problems. What? How do you still not think that you have enough? Or how do you still decide you need more? Or how do you still blame everybody? This is literally your fault. And she just, when you're in her head and you're seeing the way she thinks, it's kind of like watching a train wreck. You know, you just can't look away. And she's kind of funny. I feel bad because she's such a terrible character, but whenever she just calls people stupid or simple or something, you're just like, oh my gosh, you just never cease to be terrible. Or the ways she thinks about somebody completely innocent, a child. She can be thinking about a child and she'll just be like, ugh, about some kid. It could be her own kid and she'll still just have like these horrible thoughts. And you're just like, oh my gosh, come on, get it to stop. And you just kind of want her to stop, and then at some point you're just like, I need somebody to take you out. This is getting out of hand. Somebody needs to take you out. And watching the progression, I know I started by being like, it's a fantastic historical fiction, and the amount of effort that went into the world building and knowing the history of this time, I went from that to being like, this woman sucks and it's fun to watch. But I mean, it's quite compelling. When I read the first book, I compared some of these characters to like watching some of the characters in Game of Thrones, and I still echo that sentiment. The other character, I loved her so much. She felt very, very real. I felt for her. She was very compassionate. I feel like we don't get too many compassionate characters that are also brave. Their compassion is what makes them have courage. And I really enjoyed that character. I loved a lot of the characters in this series. I didn't love the other character, but she I feel like she was really well done. That's what I'll say about her. If you read this series, just know this trilogy is kind of like an arc in a greater story, which I actually read the next book in the story, which would be Daughter of the Otherworld, which I'll get to today as well. But I'll talk about that one in a bit. Actually, I'll just go ahead and talk about it now because it's connected to these. So Daughter of the Otherworld is like the next era, we'll say. But that does mean, because I want people to go with the correct expectations, since I am talking about the trilogy as a whole, that it's not like this is the end of everything. You're not going to get a super satisfying bow tying everything up at the end of the trilogy, because this is the first arc of this series and we're segueing into the next arc. Not in the same way as something like Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2. So those are more distinct in their eras. This is really just kind of an arc of a story, and this is the next arc of the story. So just a heads up about that, because I was very grateful that Daughter of the Otherworld was out after I read book 3, but if I didn't have Daughter of the Otherworld, I would have been like, excuse me, Shauna Lawless, what are you doing? This is not okay. But I did pick up Daughter of the Otherworld, and currently I think I was just so in love with the characters of the first trilogy, and also the stakes get so high, and you are just so invested that it's kind of hard to have that feeling of almost like a beginning again. So I do think Daughter of the Otherworld feels a bit like a middle book, even though it's the first book of a new arc. But I didn't mind, because I still enjoyed the story. I like some of the return of certain characters. I like that they're getting a little more time in the spotlight. And I like the dynamics between the characters. I actually recently compared the two main characters in this new arc as being almost like a Geralt-Ciri dynamic, which I really, really enjoyed. And in fact, I feel like that's a good way to categorize it. If you think of, you can almost think of it in, if you're a video game fan, the fact that we have Geralt having like his story in the Witcher games. I'm aware that they're based off of books also, but I'm just saying the games specifically are what if scenario after the books. And the Wild Hunt followed Geralt, and the new Witcher 4 video game is going to follow Ciri. So I feel like in that same way that you're kind of, it's still Witcher, but you're going into a different character. That's kind of the feeling of this story. But I did get kind of Geralt-Ciri vibes from two of the characters in this. But currently it's not as impactful as the trilogy because of the fact that that was its own story and I got most of it, whereas this is a new beginning. And so I'm just kind of letting it happen, and we're going to see where this author takes us. Enjoyed Daughter of the Otherworld. Very much enjoyed Gael Song. Thought it was incredible. The other two books I mentioned before would be The Sirens and A Natural History of Dragons. A Natural History of Dragons had certain aspects to it that I really enjoyed and certain aspects of it that like were a little bit less than for me. But I am going to continue on with the series. I think the biggest thing for me is that this felt a bit like a prequel, actually, because you're kind of getting the beginning of Lady Trent. She has gone on to accomplish a lot. And at the beginning of this series, she is now relaying to you her stories. And this was her first story, and it actually does feel like it's a setup for once she's officially established herself and gets to have a little bit more insight into things, and also she gets to have a little bit more agency, because you are looking at more of a Victorian era, and she has some restrictions placed on her based off the fact that she's a woman, but she also has this passion for learning more about dragons, which exist in their world basically like animals, but they're not well documented because they're very dangerous, and also they're very different from one place to the next. She has this fascination, and in the first book she's going on an expedition with her husband and some other men to learn more about these dragons, and then you kind of follow the plot of that first book. I think it's very aptly compared to, and I've compared it to, Emily Wilde. The reason that I say it had some misses is I do feel like, understandably, because she's really young and she's being honest about the fact that she was annoying when she was young, as a result, she is annoying for a lot of the book. She's very frustrating and she doesn't really know the ways of the world very much, and she doesn't always treat other people particularly well because she is of a decently high station also. But I did appreciate the growth and the inclusion of it. It just didn't change the fact that she was irritating for parts of the book. But overall, I still enjoyed this one. I did a whole in-depth review over on Patreon if you're interested in that. And then the other book that I mentioned, The Sirens, this is much more like a contemporary fiction story, but with sprinkles of fantasy to help further the thematic elements. And the thematic elements are rooted in very much the way that often victims of aggression of some kind, oftentimes this is in the form of some kind of sexual act, the way the victims of these things are often made to either feel like it was their fault or they are literally punished for the acts of someone else. So you actually have multiple timelines and different perspectives. And one is these two women on a ship who are being sent to Australia. And on the way, they are basically in a cell, these two sisters, and they're just listening to the stories of the other women around them. They are processing what happened to them. And it's very, very tragic. You're kind of trying to figure out what happened to them. You also have modern day, where a young college girl had something transpire, and she is seeking some kind of comfort from her older sister. So she goes to visit her, but her older sister is missing. And while her sister is missing, she's reading through her sister's diary, and she's finding out that her own sister had some things happen in her youth, specifically when she was in high school. And the book also examines grooming. So you're looking at, like I said, the victims of a lot of acts and how they're made to feel like it was their fault and the burden is on their shoulders. And it's kind of this collective reckoning. It's not a super easy read, as you can imagine, based off the subject material. I think that the way everything was written and the writing itself is very accessible. But of course, these are very heavy topics that maybe aren't the easiest for some people to get through. But I actually was really impressed with how the author handled a lot of these things. I think she took a lot of care. I think she balanced out the feelings of this is somehow my fault. She balanced that feeling with the reflection of once you're older and you look back and you realize, like, no, this was not my fault at all. And I think that's a hard thing to do because the fact that often when somebody has those feelings, it can come across like the book is reinforcing the idea that it's the victim's fault, but it is still realistic for somebody to think that. So I appreciate that she had that realism of the way that society makes you feel like it's your fault, but then was also adding in the reflective angle of basically, no, it wasn't. This was one that I didn't really know a whole lot in going into it. I don't think the cover really conveys what you're gonna get, but I thought it accomplished everything quite well. The next two books I want to mention would be The Everlasting, as well as Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was another patron buddy read, and I wanted to couple this one with The Everlasting because I have a similar statement for both of these, which is that I've never read anything quite like either of these, or I've never come away from anything having quite the feelings that I had for these two books. So I'll start with Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I feel like this book was so much just dwelling in its snark, and I kind of loved that about it. This book could have easily been, honestly, probably a novella. It could have been so much shorter if we're just talking about the plot, but that would have taken away everything that makes this book, I think, what it is. And what I mean by that is so many times there were things that could have just either been cut from the book, or you could have at the very least condensed it. But instead, it felt like the author took any little moment and found a way to expand upon that in the wordiest, funniest, driest way possible. That is not going to work for a lot of readers, I think. People who love this, I think they love it because of how much it leans into what it is. But I also think this is going to be a very hit or miss book for people. I could see it being a 4 or 5 star for people, or just a 1 star or DNF for a lot of individuals, because it's really, really long. It's really long. And as far as the important plot beats of this story, like I said, they really could be accomplished in a pretty short amount of time. You could have told this like fairy tale novella style, or it's a fable. And instead, it was like, let's take this random encounter between this person, any old person, doesn't even have to be the main characters. Let's just take some random person and then really, really elongate whatever scene they're in, and then have some dry British snark in there, and then have this be a person that's referenced by one of the characters later. It's one of those types of stories. And in my video I did for patrons, I described this as almost feeling like a collection of short stories with one big arc that ends up tying the whole thing together. So you have a bunch of mini arcs, and then you have the main arc of the story, but it's all within one giant standalone. The setup, if you don't know, is that you follow these two men, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, Mr. Norrell being the first main of the two that you follow. And then Strange enters pretty far into the book, actually. And the idea is they are two magicians who are bringing magic back to England. And they are using this magic in some ways to help fight against Napoleon. And in other ways, they are trying to help the general public understand magic a little bit more. Norrell doesn't really want to inform everybody else of magic so that they can use it. In fact, he goes kind of out of his way to stop anybody else from using it. And he basically hoards knowledge, whereas Strange is kind of a man of the people. He wants to share magic, and he wants to use it in any way he can. He's very enthralled by magic. And these two at times are allies, at times are rivals, and you just kind of follow their shenanigans. I mean, you just follow them as now this character is helping against the war, and now this one's helping against the war, and now this one is starting to write for this column. He's writing a book now, and you just follow them for a while. But the main antagonist is somebody that Norrell made a deal with basically in casting his spell. It's actually in ways a Fae story. So you're kind of looking at the repercussions of that act. And I wouldn't say this was a page turner. I wouldn't say it was fast-paced at all, but I did quite enjoy this one, and I don't know if I've read anything that is like it, really. I made a few comparisons for If You Like This, Try That in a recent video I did, but there's nothing that's like a one-to-one for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, at least that I've come across. It was unlike anything I've read before. The reason I wanted to couple it with The Everlasting is because also that same exact statement could be applied to this book. I haven't read anything quite like The Everlasting. I do think that this author, and the other things I've read by them, which have only been a couple, I do think there is a certain theme that the author has returned to, which is the way in which stories evolve and how they impact the present day. That idea, I saw that in Starling House, certainly, but I feel like it was perfected here. And the reason I say I've never read anything quite like this is not because of how the plot was done or because of the characters or anything like that. It was that I don't know if there are too many books that I genuinely am like, wow, and kind of in love with because of their writing and kind of their writing alone. I think that the theme is powerful, and I thought it was accomplished well, but I wouldn't say it's the most unique theme I've ever come across. I wouldn't say I was completely in love with the characters. The plot, it's hard to talk about because I don't want to say too much about it because I actually feel like the discovery of what the plot is part of the experience of this book. But as a result of how it plays out, it can be borderline repetitive. And also there can be this feeling of like, I guess we're following this again. So it's not like a what's going to happen next kind of book, because in a way you know what's going to happen next because of the whole theme of the way that stories impact the future or impact the present, or how tiny changes about the past will impact the future. And because of that, you're like, well, I know what happens in the past. And we often are focused on the past. So it's not the kind of book that you're on the edge of your seat for. However, the writing in this was exquisite. It was fantastic. The amount of times that as I was reading, I was like, I should just start this over and then get 1,000 tabs because I felt like I could tab every other paragraph. There's also this kind of cynicism in the book, and it's a very accurate reflection on our own place in society, how sometimes we're complicit in things and what it actually takes to come out of things, but it doesn't feel like it's this grand, I'm going to take the system down. It's kind of just like the little ways that we get wrapped up in things, that we excuse our own behavior, that we get caught up in our own motivations and selfish desires, and how we end up using the system for our own benefit. But then when we actually see the repercussions of it, how we're like, oh, maybe I don't like this, or maybe the end is not worth this. Even the things I wanted, even if I get it, it's not worth it. And in that journey that you go through with the characters, I think that all of that's very realistically done. And again, it's like, it's different from other stories where it's this grand, I've had my eyes opened and now I must tear the system down from the inside. It's less grand than that. It's kind of more individualistic in a sense. but a really compelling, and the writing, the amount of times that I was like, oh my gosh. So like some passages made me want to cry because they were just written so beautifully. I was very impressed. It made me want to go back and read the books that didn't quite work for me by this other author, because I was like, I don't know, maybe I just need to try them again. I mean, it was great. It was great. But also, like I said, most of the things that make up books that I love are characters and how much you pull emotions out of me through the events of the story and how those events tie back to the characters. That's another big one. I am a sucker for when I really connect to the themes of the story. It's very rare that I don't quite have that connection with the characters. And even bad things can happen to the characters, and I'm not that emotionally choked up about it, yet the writing alone is so beautiful that I'm like, wow, this is great. So I felt that about The Everlasting. But at the same time, if the writing doesn't click with you, if you don't really like the writing, and you also don't love the characters and other such things, I could see this not working for some people at all. Regardless, though, if you're even vaguely interested in any of the things I said about this one, I would say give it a try. Give it a try. It was very different. I've never felt quite like that for a book before. Another book that I picked up that was a Goodreads nominee, like The Everlasting and like the Sirens that I mentioned before, would be A Resistance of Witches. Mentioned this one recently. It's witches fighting Nazis, and it was awesome, and it was a lot of fun, and also I felt like I was watching a movie. It was very cinematic in how it was written. It's a standalone. It utilized the standalone format fantastically. I had such a blast with this one. And as I was reading it, I was like, I'm kind of into this. Like, this is really, I'm liking this. And sorry if you heard my dog grumble. The more that it went, the more I was just like, wow, I'm getting really attached to these characters. One of the characters was just so awesome. She was so awesome. I'm like, you're braver than me. You're cooler than me. You're braver than everybody. Like, she was just really great. Another character, she is the one that is more so a witch, and she's somebody who stands for justice, but she just felt like a really real person. And then another character is very sweet and kind, and the way that their magic is incorporated into the story was really cool. It was great. I had such a blast with The Resistance of Witches. So if you want to read a story about witches fighting Nazis, this book, I mean, I know that's what it is, and that's a very specific thing, but it was great. Two books that I read arcs of, so I'm not going to elaborate too much on these until closer to their release dates, but I at least wanted to mention them, would be This Kingdom Will Not Kill Me, first book by this author I've read. It was fun. I don't know how it's going to get marketed, because I saw it listed as Romantasy, and I don't know if I totally agree with that label. The setup for the story is that you follow somebody who typically lived in our world, and then she gets transported into her favorite fictional world. However, the time period she's in her fictional world, it's not where the books go. So she actually knows what's going to happen, and a lot of really devastating things happen. It's evidently very grimdark, and she wants to basically try to save her favorite characters, and she also wants to survive because she has no idea how she got here, and she wants to go home. So that's the general setup for the story, and it's interesting to watch her navigate. How can I almost give away pieces of the future so that things will course correct, but I don't give away so much that then I lose value as a seer, because if everybody course corrects too much, then I will no longer be able to predict what's going to happen. So I thought that setup for the idea of the story where you're transported into a fictional world was pretty clever. I liked that difference. I did have some things about it I didn't love, but I had fun with it. I'm curious what's going to happen in the sequel. Heart of the Nhaga is another arc that I read. This is a South Korean epic fantasy that's being translated into English for the first time. It was awesome. I can't wait until this is officially out and I can talk about it a little bit more, or shortly before it's out, I can talk about it a little bit more, because this is going to, I think for a lot of people, feel like classic fantasy, but different because of the fact that it's not influenced by a lot of what our classic fantasy was influenced by. So the influences are different, but it still has that feel of this just epicness to it, and also the lore is very different than what we're accustomed to, which was fantastic. And then also you have this group of characters that are going on this mission together, and they're from different races of beings. Also, the races of beings are unlike anything we've seen before. So for example, giant humanoid chickens, which was great, and these particular individuals are known for being ferocious warriors. That's an example of what I mean by not quite like a lot of what we've seen before. I really enjoyed this one. The cultures of this were really interesting. I've made clear before that Wheel of Time didn't necessarily quite work for me, but I do think Wheel of Time, part of what people love about it is just how much detail has been poured into the crafting of the different cultures from one place to the next. And that's what parts of this one reminded me of, because the cultures were just so well accomplished. The world building was great. I'm excited. I can't wait for this one to be out so I can talk about it more. So that was another arc I read. And then last for today, I have talked about this one in a number of recent videos, so I'm going to keep it brief, and that would be Legacy of Brightwash. I read this one at the very end of 2025, and it was phenomenal. The general setup is that you follow this man who is basically like a detective enforcer type of character. He comes across this body of a young girl, so on one hand he's trying to figure out what's happened with her, and then on the other he is starting to reckon with the fact that he is a part of a system that has actually imprisoned his own son. And his own son is one of the characters. The reason he's been in prison is because he refuses to register for something that oppresses a lot of other individuals. He does not want to be a part of it. He doesn't agree with it, so he makes a stand, and he's being punished for it. And it's causing his own father to really question everything he's ever stood for, and does he even stand for the principles he thought he stood for, and is he actually part of a much, much greater problem? But at the same time, it feels like if he abandons that, then who will ever actually learn about what's happening to individuals like this young girl whose body he finds? So there's a lot more to it than just that, but even that alone is very compelling and very tragic. This book is very adult, it's very heavy in a lot of its themes, but I thought it was exceptionally well done, and it's incredibly underhyped. So if you are interested in this, please, please, please check it out. It's very, very good. That's it though for this January and slight end of December wrap up. If you are interested in any of these books, I will have the books themselves as well as any reviews I've done in the description bar. If you're interested in joining the Patreon so that you can join in on patron live shows, patron exclusives, or Discord movie nights, feel free to hop in there as well. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.